Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the past, a time when the simple act of opening a window could be considered an act of rebellion. Yes, tonight's sleepy stroll through history takes us into the pungent, plague-scented world of medieval medicine, where doctors feared fresh air almost as much as they feared hand-washing. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy these late-night detours into history's more absurd corners. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from, and what time it is for you. It's always 2 AM somewhere, and if you're here, you're probably trying to fall asleep to the gentle sound of human misery from 700 years ago. Now, dim your lights, pull your blanket up to your chin, and take a deep breath of clean, filtered, 21st century air, because you're about to meet people who thought that same breath could literally kill you. Congratulations. You've just woken up in the year 1348. You've got a fever, a rash, and a doctor approaching your bedside holding a live pigeon and a stick of burning herbs. Things are about to get weird. Your doctor arrives dressed like a bird, literally. A long beaked mask stuffed with lavender and vinegar-soaked cloth meant to filter out bad air. In his bag, leeches, rusty knives, and a confidence far greater than his medical knowledge. You might call it malpractice. He calls it science. He steps into your dimly lit cottage, eyes glinting through smoked glass goggles. You, the unfortunate patient, are wrapped in blankets, sweating like a rotisserie chicken. The air smells of smoke, sickness, and something vaguely poultry adjacent, which makes sense. Your doctor's about to wave a dead pigeon over you. Don't worry, this is part of the treatment. Apparently, birds are like medieval sponges. They absorb the disease. The pigeon dies, you live. Everyone claps. That's medicine now. His bag of tools is a carnival of questionable choices. A dull scalpel, some twine, a jar of leeches, a wooden spoon, and a prayer book. It's unclear which tool he trusts most, but judging by the number of crosses drawn in the air, the prayer book is doing most of the heavy lifting. He rummages around and pulls out a vial of something greenish. Wormwood tincture, he says proudly. Good for humours, bad for demons. You take a sip. It tastes like dirt, despair, and regret. He nods approvingly. She'll be right as rain. Rain, incidentally, is also believed to cause disease, but details are for philosophers, not physicians. Every symptom, no matter how mild, leads to the same conclusion. Your humours are unbalanced. Coughing, too much phlegm. Headache, too much black bile. A broken leg. Clearly your yellow bile is feeling chaotic. The cure is always the same. Remove something. Blood, bile, dignity, doesn't matter. Out it goes. The logic was simple. If you're sick, you must have too much of something. The cure, subtraction. Enter the leeches. Dozens of them wriggling like damp spaghetti, ready to balance your essence. The doctor places them on your skin while mumbling about equilibrium. You watch, horrified, as tiny creatures do their best impression of medieval IV therapy. When they're done, you're pale, dizzy, and somehow charge 2 chickens for the experience. It's a good deal. Last week your neighbour was prescribed amputation for a sore throat, but bloodletting isn't the only trick up the medieval sleeve. There's also cupping, placing hot glass jars on the skin to draw out the bad vapours. The result? Giant bruises and mild trauma, which means it's working. If that doesn't help, he might recommend trepanation, drilling a hole in your skull to release the evil spirits. Many patients claim to feel lighter afterward. Technically true, considering part of their head is now missing. Of course, cleanliness isn't part of the process. Tools are wiped on aprons, hands are rinsed in wine, if you're lucky, and the concept of sterilisation is still several hundred years away. The doctor's boots, caked with mud from the last patient's grave, squelch as he moves closer. He opens your mouth, peers inside and mutters, "Ah yes, the humours are angry." His solution? A spoonful of honey, a dab of crushed emerald, and a quick confession to cleanse the soul. Spiritual and medical health were the same thing. Sin could make you sneeze, and repentance might cure dysentery. He finally packs up his tools, declaring you improved. You're still feverish, barely conscious, and possibly missing half your blood, but you did survive the treatment, which means it worked, apparently. The doctor leaves, pocketing your last silver coin and whispering something about burning rosemary to keep the air polite. Outside, the wind blows through the crooked streets, carrying the smell of manure and mortality. But behind your shuttered window, the air grows thick and still, exactly how your doctor likes it. You're alive for now. Congratulations. You've survived medieval healthcare where every cure was worse than the disease, and hope was the only medicine that didn't cost extra. To the medieval mind, air wasn't refreshing. It was dangerous. The word miasma meant polluted vapour, and they believed diseases floated through it like invisible curses. If your neighbour coughed, you didn't open a window. You stuffed it shut with hay and prayed. In the dim candlelight of a medieval home, people lived in constant suspicion of the air itself. You could trust neither wind nor breeze. The moment a chill crept through the cracks in your walls, you could almost hear your grandmother whisper, "That's how it starts." So instead of embracing ventilation, families barricaded themselves in like panicked squirrels. The result? Rooms so stuffy they could be legally declared soups. And not the good kind. The kind of soup that makes you question your life choices and the life expectancy of everyone sharing the same oxygen. The belief in miasma wasn't just a rumour, it was the science of the day. Learned men in heavy robes debated which winds were morally corrupt. The west wind, they might declare, brings melancholia and boils. The south wind, argued another, smells like sin. Nobody mentioned that both winds also carried the same scent: open sewage and regret. Medieval scholars even published elaborate charts detailing which direction you should sleep in to avoid being possessed by a particularly rude breeze. If you were unlucky enough to be born near a swamp or, heaven forbid, a tannery, you might as well start writing your will at birth. City officials, in their infinite medieval wisdom, took the fear of air and ran with it. When plague broke out, they passed laws against air movement. Windows were sealed, chimneys plugged, and people ordered to burn incense until the streets smelled like a potpourri store run by Satan himself. Fresh air was treated like an outlaw, the kind of thing that could sneak into your house at night and whisper disease into your ear. To purify the atmosphere, workers walked the streets with torches of burning herbs and buckets of vinegar, creating what must have been the world's first and least effective aromatherapy parade. Meanwhile, ordinary folks tried their best to survive in a world where breathing was basically gambling. Housewives waved cloth soaked in wine around their babies' cribs, hoping to chase away invisible devils. Men carried pomanders, little metal balls filled with spices, tied to their belts, swinging like scented medieval fidget spinners. If you were poor, you couldn't afford cloves or cinnamon, so you settled for the budget option: onions. You'd hang them by the window, believing they'd suck up the bad air. The only thing they actually sucked up was your dignity. And yet, the fear had its logic. The streets reeked of decay, and with no concept of germs, people needed something to blame. Imagine walking through a medieval city, open gutters running with waste, butchered animal parts tossed into the street, and that thick, throat-coating stench of humanity living too close together. You'd believe the air was evil too. Every gust from the marketplace carried a buffet of invisible nightmares. A sneeze wasn't just a sneeze, it was a social event, often followed by a full-blown exorcism of the nostrils. When plague arrived, it only confirmed their worst fears. The Black Death rolled across Europe like a bad smell with legs. People noticed that those who lived near cleaner-smelling areas, upwind or near gardens, seemed to fare slightly better. Naturally, this wasn't because of fresh air or lower rat populations. No, clearly it was because of holy breezes. Towns even hired air guardians, whose job was to stand at the gates waving incense sticks like confused wizards, trying to keep out the apocalypse. Inside homes, the paranoia reached new heights, literally. Wealthier families built rooms on higher floors, believing bad air sank like shame. Poor families, on the other hand, just burned more herbs and hoped for the best. When the smoke got too thick to see your family, that was considered a sign it was working. Ironically, by trying so hard to avoid dangerous air, people trapped themselves in conditions that made disease even easier to spread. A closed, smoky, humid room full of coughing humans. A bacteria's paradise. But medieval logic was a loop. If everyone was dying, it must mean the air wasn't sealed tight enough. So, they sealed it tighter. By the end of winter, homes smelled like a combination of sweat, fear, and whatever herbs hadn't caught fire yet. And yet, despite the madness, there's something strangely human about it all. They were scared, confused, and doing their best with what little they knew. It's easy to laugh now, until you remember someone in the future will probably laugh at our health advice too. Maybe 500 years from now, someone will whisper, "Can you believe they used to breathe recycled air from little metal boxes called airplanes?" And the audience will shudder, because in every age the real fear isn't just sickness. It's realizing that you might be wrong about the invisible stuff keeping you alive. Every sickness, plague, fever, toothache, heartbreak was blamed on foul air rising from swamps, corpses, or the unwashed masses. Towns smelled like soup made of death and onions, and everyone thought the smell itself was contagious. Ironically, they weren't entirely wrong. In the medieval world, the word miasma had real power, whispered like a curse, written in trembling ink on parchment by men in robes who were convinced they were unlocking the secrets of the universe. The miasma theory explained everything that frightened humanity but couldn't be seen. It wasn't the rat, the water, or the bacteria. They didn't know those existed yet. No, it was the air, the villain that slithered invisibly through cities, bringing decay wherever it drifted. You could smell it before it struck. A bad odour meant death was on its way. Picture a medieval street at dawn. The mist hangs low, mingling with smoke from 100 fireplaces. The cobblestones are slick with, let's say, organic material. Somewhere a butcher dumps yesterday's scraps into the gutter. A pig snuffles through it, then promptly becomes tonight's dinner. To the medieval mind, this isn't a sanitation issue, it's an atmospheric one. The air has gone foul, they'd say, and only the wealthy can afford to flee uphill to where the clean winds live. Doctors of the time were obsessed with tracing the paths of these evil vapours. They drew maps showing how air flowed from infected districts to healthy ones, as if the sky itself were conspiring. Entire neighbourhoods were declared unbreathable. Citizens burned piles of herbs at crossroads to stop the miasma from crossing over, a kind of medieval border control for oxygen. The logic was so beautifully wrong it almost made sense. After all, people near foul-smelling places did tend to get sick more often. They just didn't realise it wasn't the smell killing them. It was the fleas, the water, or the general lack of basic hygiene. Still, to a population that bathed twice a year and lived next to open sewers, bad air seemed like the only reasonable explanation. When plague swept through towns, panic thickened the air even more. People believed miasma could sneak in through their pores while they slept. They sealed doors, plugged chimneys, and stuffed their noses with herbs. Streets filled with smoke from bonfires meant to purify the town, but really it just made everything smell like roasted despair. Even doctors couldn't agree on what counted as bad air. Some said it was black and sticky. Others swore it had a colour, greenish, like swamp fog. A few ambitious scholars claimed it could whisper your name if you were about to die. The superstition wasn't limited to peasants. Kings and scholars panicked too. Royal physicians demanded that entire castles be fumigated with vinegar and juniper. Monks waved incense in cloisters until the smoke alarmed passing shepherds. The wealthy carried bouquets called posies to mask the odour of death, which is why the nursery rhyme Ring Around the Rosie is basically an ancient horror story disguised as a lullaby. There were even fashion trends born from the fear. Perfumed gloves, scented veils, and elaborate pomanders, metal orbs filled with cloves and musk, dangled from belts like medieval AirPods. People would press them to their noses during public executions, pretending it was for moral reasons, when really they just didn't want to inhale the crowd. But the fear of miasma did one unintentional favour for humanity. It forced cities to care, a little, about cleanliness. Civic leaders began clearing waste pits and draining swamps, not out of compassion, but out of sheer terror that the air would turn against them. Bad smells bring death, they said. And for once, doing the right thing by accident actually worked. Streets got cleaner, death rates dropped. Nobody knew why, but everyone took credit. Still, the obsession with invisible air persisted for centuries. Even into the 19th century, when microscopes were revealing a world teeming with germs, doctors clung stubbornly to the idea of miasma, because it's comforting, in a strange way, to imagine that evil comes as a smell you can sense, rather than as something too small to see. So the next time you light a candle that says eucalyptus cleanse, or crack open a window to refresh the vibe, remember, you're carrying on a medieval tradition. The only difference is your bad air comes from takeout leftovers instead of the Black Death, and deep down maybe that old fear still lingers, that somewhere out there Floating just beyond sight, the great invisible murderer is waiting for a chance to strike again. When plague struck, city leaders ordered citizens to seal their homes tight. Windows were nailed shut, streets doused with vinegar, and people carried bouquets under their noses just to survive the smell of other people surviving. Imagine it! The year is 1348, and your city has just been declared plague-infested. Bells toll, priests chant through the haze, and a man with a wheelbarrow wanders by shouting, "Bring out your dead!" Meanwhile, you're inside your one-room home, carefully hammering boards over the only window. Not because of burglars, oh no, but because you believe that a single whisper of wind might slide in carrying the world's deadliest breath. The logic was airtight, pun intended. Fresh air was thought to be the carrier of death itself. The plague was invisible, odourless until too late, and therefore blamed on the wicked vapour that drifted through cities like gossip. And so, people obeyed the city decrees. Close everything. Shut the windows, seal the chimneys, even plug keyholes with rags soaked in vinegar. The result? Medieval homes turned into warm, sweaty tombs of paranoia. Families gathered around smouldering fires, the air thick enough to chew. They sprinkled the floor with the herbs, burned rosemary and hung garlic by the door. The rich had silver incense burners shaped like lions or angels. The poor just lit whatever they could find. Old boots, dung, fish bones. If it produced smoke, it was purifying. By day 2, most households smelled like a witch's kitchen, and a landfill had a baby. City streets didn't fare much better. Officials, convinced that miasma rose from the ground, poured vinegar and wine across cobblestones as makeshift disinfectant. Workers with cloths over their faces splashed sour liquid onto every corner, while others paraded with bundles of sage set ablaze. The scent of burning herbs mixed with rotting flesh and horse manure, the kind of aroma that would make modern perfume companies declare bankruptcy on the spot. Of course, none of this worked. The plague didn't care about locked windows or lavender smoke. It rode on fleas and rats, thriving precisely in the dark, humid rooms people were hiding inside. But medieval citizens were nothing if not committed. If their neighbours started coughing, they stuffed the cracks in the walls with mud. If a child sneezed, they burned a shoe. When someone died, they didn't bury them right away. That required opening the door, and that would let in air. Then there were the city cleansing rituals. Entire neighbourhoods would line up as men in long robes walked through the streets swinging censers of incense. Behind them, workers carried barrels of vinegar water to sprinkle on walls. The goal was to heal the air, though mostly it just kept the rats damp and confused. A few enthusiastic towns even fired cannons to disperse the vapours, proving that humans have always believed explosions solve everything. Inside homes, superstition mixed with desperation. Some families hung bouquets called posies over the door. Others crafted pomanders, little metal spheres filled with herbs, to wear around the neck. Every breath became a mini-religious ritual. People inhaled hope, exhaled terror, and pretended it helped. Children learned early to hold flowers near their faces, leading to the eerie sight of entire streets full of people, sniffing roses like paranoid botanists. Meanwhile, doctors, the ones brave or foolish enough to still visit patients, leaned into the hysteria. They strutted down alleys in their plague masks, the long beaks stuffed with mint, cloves, and myrrh. These masks made them look like birds from a fever dream, but they were considered state-of-the-art protection. Ironically, those masks probably did help a little, filtering out some bacteria, though not nearly enough to justify charging 2 goats and a silver coin per visit, and yet fear of air became law. In Venice, guards patrolled canals to make sure no one aired out laundry. Moving air was seen as a health hazard. In London, city decrees banned gatherings, then immediately encouraged everyone to burn more fires, which filled the city with smoke thicker than the fog. The contradiction was perfect. To avoid deadly air, they created more of it. But perhaps the most tragic part was how this fear of air isolated people. Neighbours no longer spoke through open windows. Friends shouted greetings from behind locked doors. Lovers blew kisses through cloth, convinced their breath might kill the other. Humanity's greatest comfort, connection, was reduced to muffled whispers through wooden walls. Still, in that strange, suffocating world, you can almost understand the reasoning. The unseen was terrifying. The smell of decay was everywhere. People didn't know about bacteria. only that death came after bad smells and wind. So they fought the only way they knew how, with flowers, fire and hope, held tightly under their noses. And as absurd as it sounds now, maybe it's not so different from us. We still light candles for comfort, spray scents to cleanse rooms, and open or close windows depending on what the internet tells us. The tools have changed, but the instinct remains. The medieval world didn't fear air because they were foolish. They feared it because it reminded them they weren't in control. And really, that's the kind of fear that never quite goes out of style. Since bad smells cause sickness, good smells must cure it. Or so they thought. Doctors prescribed rosewater baths for fevers and perfume for the soul. Wealthy patients burned cinnamon while peasants clutched onions like medieval air fresheners. This was the golden age of smell-based healthcare, when your survival depended entirely on your fragrance. To medieval doctors, the nose was like a diagnostic tool and a medicine cabinet combined. If it stank, it was dangerous. If it smelled pleasant, it was practically holy. In this world, your health could hinge on how well you masked the scent of death. And considering the medieval lifestyle, there was a lot of masking to do. Doctors of the time believed that smells had personality. A foul odour was evil, aggressive and corrupting. A pleasant scent was virtuous, balancing, even spiritual. The goal wasn't just to smell nice, it was to fight the smell of decay, one whiff at a time. So while the peasants prayed for rain and bread, the rich spent fortunes bathing in rosewater and lighting sticks of incense that turned their bedrooms into very flammable spas. The logic was simple and perfectly medieval. If disease came from bad air, then sweet air could restore your humours. Physicians compiled long lists of odour therapies. For headaches, burn lavender. For melancholy, boil cloves in wine. For plague, a mix of vinegar, juniper and hope. Apothecaries smelled like bakeries run by mad scientists. Shelves overflowed with herbs, resins, oils and powders. Patients walked in sick and walked out smelling like a cake left too long in a forest. Of course, the most powerful medicine was perfume. Not just the dab behind the ear kind, we're talking medical grade perfume soaked into gloves, hats and even candles. The nobility believed the scent could create an invisible armour around the body, warding off evil vapours. One popular belief claimed that the Virgin Mary herself protected those who smelled of lilies. This might explain why half of Europe walked around reeking like a funeral bouquet. For the poor, things were less floral. They couldn't afford imported spices or perfumed oils, so they turned to the next best thing, onions and garlic. These humble bulbs were the working man's cure-all, used to clean the air and scare away sickness, and, as an unintended side effect, everyone else. Families hung strings of onions by the door, wore them around their necks, and sometimes even slept with one under the pillow. You could almost picture a peasant waking up, sniffing the room and thinking, "Ah, yes, still alive, must be working." Meanwhile, street vendors cashed in on the craze. Travelling scent doctors wandered from town to town selling sachets filled with herbs and mystery powders. They'd shout promises like, "One sniff, and the plague shall pass thee by." In truth, it was mostly crushed flowers and sawdust, but people were desperate. Anything that smelled strong enough to mask the stench of reality was worth its weight in gold, or onions. Churches joined the olfactory arms race too. The faithful burned mountains of incense during Mass, filling cathedrals with clouds so thick you could barely see the priest. It was both spiritual warfare and crowd control. If the disease didn't leave your body, at least it couldn't find you through the fog. Pilgrims carried little relics soaked in holy oils, believing the scent alone could repel evil. To this day, some monasteries still make those same oils, though now they call them essential. There were even scent-based fashion statements. Pomanders, small, ornate metal balls filled with perfumes, became the medieval equivalent of hand sanitizer. Nobles clipped them to their belts or held them under their noses when travelling through the less sanitary parts of town, which was frankly all of it. These pomanders were engraved with prayers, gemstones, and sometimes tiny mirrors, because if the smell didn't ward off sickness, maybe vanity would. And while it's easy to laugh at the idea of perfume as medicine, it wasn't completely foolish. Many herbs and resins they used, like rosemary, sage and frankincense, actually have mild antibacterial properties, so while medieval people didn't know why it helped, some of their sniff-based superstition had accidental science behind it. Still, no amount of cinnamon smoke was going to stop the Black Death from kicking down the door. but that didn't stop them from trying. At the height of the plague, entire cities smelled like an over-enthusiastic candle shop. Streets filled with the scent of burning spice, vinegar-soaked linen, and fear. Doctors, sweating in their heavy robes, waved censers full of herbs around patients who were far too sick to notice. If you were lucky, you died smelling faintly of cloves. In the end, good smells weren't just medicine. They were comfort. They gave people the illusion of control, a way to fight the invisible. The scent of roses could mean hope. The smell of mint meant safety. And even if it didn't cure anyone, it softened the horror just enough to let them sleep at night. And maybe that's the real magic of scent. Not that it keeps you healthy, but that it makes you believe you're safe. After all, when the world smells like death, even the faintest whiff of cinnamon can feel like a miracle. Picture this. Your room is dark, damp, and full of smoke from the hearth. You sleep beside 6 relatives and a goat. Air circulation? None. But don't open the window. Your local physician says a draft could invite death. You simply marinate in your own survival. It's night time in a medieval household, and the concept of personal space has yet to be invented. Beds are for families, sometimes extended ones. You, your siblings, your parents, and the occasional farm animal share one straw-filled mattress that smells like a combination of earth, sweat, and dairy. The straw isn't changed often, maybe twice a year if you're fancy. Beneath you, generations of flattened insects form what historians might generously call a foundation. The air is thick, heavy, and possibly sentient. Now imagine it's winter, which in medieval terms lasted roughly 11.5 months. You've stuffed the cracks in your walls with rags, sealed the door with mud, and hung a damp sheet over the window to block the death wind. Your only heat source is a small fire burning in the corner, and the smoke lingers low, curling through the room like an unwelcome guest who refuses to leave. Within minutes, your eyes sting and your throat scratches, but congratulations! You've avoided the plague by asphyxiating instead. In theory, sleeping by the fire should be cosy. In practice, it's a delicate dance between freezing and spontaneous combustion. Families rotated positions during the night to avoid anyone roasting too long. And if you thought the fire provided light, think again. The only illumination came from the occasional spark landing dangerously close to your nightshirt. Romance novels never mention that part. The smell of a medieval bedroom was ambitious, a mixture of damp hay, unwashed feet, tallow candles, and animal breath. Hygiene wasn't a priority because doctors warned that bathing could open the pores and let bad air in. So instead of cleaning, people fumigated themselves with smoke and herbs, believing that was safer. If your neighbour's house smelled like rosemary, it wasn't because they were fancy, it was because they were panicking. Let's not forget the chamber pot, that charming bedside feature. There was no midnight stroll to the outhouse. You simply rolled over, did your business in a bowl and placed it under the bed. By morning the air had developed layers, like an ancient lasagna of human effort and regret. Emptying the pot was often a child's chore, which explains a lot about medieval childhood trauma. Pests were constant roommates. Fleas and lice thrived in the cosy environment of shared blankets and wool tunics. If you scratched, people didn't think you were dirty. They thought you were alive. Bedbugs were so common that folk songs mentioned them. Even rats considered the medieval bedroom a decent place to start a family. The only upside, you never felt lonely. Privacy, of course, didn't exist. If your parents needed to discuss finances, discipline a child or conceive a new one, it all happened right there in your shared sleeping space. You learned early to close your eyes, pretend to be asleep, and focus on counting ceiling cobwebs instead of sheep. And yes, the goat snored, loudly. For wealthier households, things were only slightly better. They had curtained beds, wooden frames draped with thick fabric, to trap warmth and unfortunately smells. Servants slept at the foot of the bed or even underneath it, ready to fetch water or fend off burglars. A noble's bedroom was more ornate, but no less crowded. The air inside was dense enough to qualify as a new ecosystem. Occasionally, someone would get bold and open a window just a crack. This was considered a scandalous act of defiance. If anyone fell ill afterward, even from bad bread, the blame immediately fell on that reckless gust of air. Stories spread quickly. Did you hear? Old Agnes opened her shutter for 1 minute and died of the draught. That was enough to keep everyone sealed up for another century. And yet, Amid the filth and fumes, life carried on. People laughed, told stories, and somehow found comfort in the closeness. Babies were born, elders snored through it all, and the human instinct to survive kept them going, even when the air felt more like stew than atmosphere. So when you crawl into your clean, quiet bed tonight, take a moment to appreciate your pillow-top mattress, your sheets that don't crunch, and the miracle of ventilation. Because in the medieval world, bedtime wasn't rest. It was a test of endurance, a nightly gamble against smoke, smell, and suffocation. And somehow, against all odds, humanity won. Fresh air was bad, but sweating out your illness, that was cutting edge. Physicians wrapped patients in blankets, heated the room to boil the humours, and waited. Congratulations, you're now cured of oxygen and hydration. In the strange logic of medieval medicine, sickness wasn't something you treated. It was something you battled through endurance and perspiration. To sweat was to live. To sweat more was to heal. So when you came down with a fever, your doctor's solution wasn't rest or fresh air. It was turning your bedroom into a slow cooker and watching you simmer. The theory came straight from the beloved four humours system, that ancient, wildly confident idea that the body was made up of four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were sick, one of them was clearly being dramatic. Sweating, the doctors reasoned, could restore balance by letting the bad humour escape through your pores. And so, you'd find yourself bundled like a medieval burrito surrounded by steaming pots of water and burning herbs, while your physician nodded approvingly, saying, "Ah yes, the sickness is fleeing the body." Patients were often placed in what were called sweating chambers, tiny, enclosed rooms heated by stoves or coals, filled with aromatic smoke and misery. The experience was described as revitalizing by doctors and unbearable by everyone else. Within minutes the air turned thick and heavy, and the patient's face would glisten, not with health, but with the universal expression of someone realizing they'd paid for this. And it wasn't just the sick who sweated. The rich did it preemptively. Nobles turned sweating into a form of wellness tourism, medieval spa days where you could purge your sins and your electrolytes simultaneously. They'd lounge in wooden sweat boxes, sipping spiced wine and gossiping about who had the best boils that season. The logic was the same: bad humours out, good humours in, fainting optional. Of course, hydration wasn't part of the equation. Water was considered suspicious, too cold, too damp. Instead, patients were given hot beer, mulled wine, or broth thick enough to chew. Doctors believed these warm and moist drinks would keep the humours flowing nicely. In reality, they just replaced lost fluids with alcohol and salt. But if the patient collapsed, it was never the treatment's fault. The illness was too strong, they'd say, wiping sweat from their own powdered brows. There was even a more extreme version, the blanket method. The doctor would wrap you in layer after layer of wool until you could barely breathe. Then, heated stones or boiling pots were placed nearby to raise the temperature even further. The patient would sweat, hallucinate, and occasionally faint, all excellent signs apparently. "Behold," the physician would declare, "the sickness is being forced out." What actually left the body was consciousness. For extra flair, many treatments involved adding herbs to the sweat ritual: mint for melancholy, sage for strength, and mustard seeds for nearly everything else. Some physicians even used animal fats to seal in the warmth, creating what might be the earliest version of the world's worst spa treatment. You'd emerge slippery, disoriented, and smelling like optimism gone wrong. In monasteries, where medicine mixed with religion, sweating became both cure and confession. Monks would tend to patients while chanting prayers, fanning incense, and occasionally sprinkling holy water, which probably evaporated before it hit the ground. To them, the rising steam symbolized evil leaving the body. To the patient, it probably symbolized regret. And yet, beneath all the superstition, there was a faint glimmer of sense. Inducing sweat can lower fevers slightly and promote detoxification, though perhaps not when you're locked in a windowless room next to a pot of boiling onions. But in a world without antibiotics or real science, anything that made a patient look like they were fighting the illness was considered victory. Sometimes patients did survive, mostly because they were young, lucky, or stubborn. When they recovered, doctors proudly credited the sweat treatment. When they didn't, well, clearly the patient hadn't sweated enough, so there you'd be. Drenched, dizzy, and wrapped tighter than a Christmas ham, your physician's smiling at you through a haze of incense. He might pat your hand and say, "You're much improved." You'd nod weakly, unsure whether you were cured or cooked. Still, in a time when air was deadly, bloodletting was normal, and germs hadn't even been invented yet, sweating felt like something you could control. It gave people a ritual, a way to believe they were doing something. And maybe that belief, that stubborn, sweaty hope, was its own kind of medicine. Because in medieval healthcare, success didn't mean comfort or logic. It meant surviving long enough for your doctor to say, "Told you so," before moving on to the next patient, and the next pot of boiling water. Those famous masks weren't for style. The long beak was stuffed with herbs and vinegar-soaked sponges to clean the air before it reached the doctor's lungs. Ironically, they probably saved lives, not from miasma, but from the sheer stench of their patients. The plague doctor was one of history's most unintentionally terrifying creations. Part physician, part omen of doom, and part walking air freshener. When the Black Death rolled into town, these figures appeared like something from a nightmare. Dressed head to toe in waxed leather, eyes hidden behind glass lenses, and a long bird-like mask jutting out like an accusation. If you saw one approaching, it didn't mean help had arrived. It meant your neighbourhood was officially doomed. The costume was designed for survival, or at least for what medieval people thought survival looked like. The beak wasn't meant to be fashionable, it was a primitive filter. Inside, the doctor packed all sorts of strong-smelling items: lavender, mint, cloves, myrrh, juniper berries, vinegar-soaked rags, even crushed roses or garlic. Anything that could overpower the smell of rotting flesh and open sewers counted as medicine. The idea was that if bad smells caused disease, good ones could block it out. In practice, it was like walking through a city-sized compost heap wearing a portable potpourri. Their outfit didn't stop there. The doctors wore a long black coat made of waxed fabric or leather to keep out infected air. Gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat completed the look, making them resemble some unholy mix between a crow and a bureaucrat. The stick they carried wasn't decorative either. It was a socially distanced diagnostic tool. With it, they could poke, prod, or shoo away patients without getting too close. A genius invention for anyone who wanted to keep their job and their lungs. The irony, of course, is that the outfit worked, but not for the reasons anyone thought. The layers of leather and wax actually provided a crude barrier against fleas, the real culprits of the plague. The herbs, meanwhile, didn't purify the air, but they did make breathing in a corpse-filled city slightly less horrifying. In short, the plague doctor's success had nothing to do with science, and everything to do with accident. Inside the mask, however, life was miserable. Doctors described breathing as hot and damp, with condensation fogging up the lenses and the stench of vinegar baking in the sun. Many could only wear the mask for short bursts before fainting or tearing it off in disgust. Yet they kept donning the costume, because nothing said "I'm taking this seriously" quite like dressing as a murder bird. Their work wasn't glamorous either. Plague doctors often went door to door recording deaths, inspecting bodies, or performing what passed for treatment: bloodletting, lancing buboes, or applying mixtures of butter and arsenic, a skincare routine that definitely didn't catch on. They were part doctor, part accountant, part grim reaper. Some were skilled physicians, others were just people willing to risk their lives for a paycheck. Many didn't survive the job long enough to spend it, and yet their eerie presence became iconic. Children feared them, artists painted them, poets compared them to angels of death. Even centuries later, the image of the beaked mask still gives us chills, not because it's evil, but because it reminds us of a world that fought the invisible with imagination and leather. If you stood in a plague-ridden street and saw one approaching through the smoke, you might have felt both dread and relief. Relief that someone, anyone, was willing to face the horror. Dread because if they were there, things were already too late. So yes, the plague doctor's outfit might look ridiculous now, but in its own way it was genius. It protected them from the smell, from fleas, and from hope itself. And as medieval medicine went, that was practically a miracle. Thyme, rosemary, lavender, not for cooking, but for survival. People stuffed herbs into their clothing, hung them from ceilings, and even chewed them during sermons. Because nothing says faith like mint-flavoured paranoia. To the medieval nose, herbs weren't seasoning, they were shields. When the world outside smelled like death, dung and damp despair, anything green and fragrant felt like salvation. The line between cooking ingredient and medical defence was non-existent. You might toss sage into your soup, then immediately rub it on your chest for protection against evil air. Garlic wasn't just for flavouring bread, it was spiritual armour, believed to frighten away demons, disease, and probably your friends. Every home, from peasant cottages to royal chambers, had its collection of hanging herbs. They dangled from beams, tucked into corners, stuffed into sacks under beds. The goal? To purify the air, soak up bad vapours, and make sure that when death came knocking, your house at least smelled like an apothecary. Housewives would sweep the floor with bundles of thyme, scatter dried lavender across rushes, and burn rosemary as incense. The result was a sort of rustic aromatherapy, except instead of calm, it was fueled by panic. The church even approved of this botanical obsession. Monks cultivated vast gardens of healing herbs, both for medicine and air purification. They grew mint, basil, marjoram and angelica, tending to them like holy relics. When plague struck, monasteries filled with smoke as the brethren burned their harvest in desperate attempts to sanctify the air. Imagine walking through those cloisters, the haze of sage, the chanting, the faint sound of someone coughing in Latin. It was equal parts hospital and herbal sauna. Herbs weren't just hung or burned, they were worn. People stitched sprigs of lavender into their clothes, rubbed crushed mint behind their ears, and tied sachets of fragrant leaves around their necks. These little pouches were known as nosegays or posies, the medieval equivalent of portable air purifiers. If you had money, you could afford exotic ingredients like cloves, nutmeg and cinnamon, imported from far-off lands at ruinous prices. If you didn't, you settled for local options like wild thyme and onion skins. Both worked equally poorly, but at least you smelled busy. The belief in herbal protection ran deep. Physicians swore by it. City officials encouraged it. In times of plague, they even mandated the burning of herbs in the streets. You could walk through a medieval town and see smoke rising from every window. Rosemary in one house, sage in another, maybe a touch of mint for those feeling fancy. The air shimmered with spice and desperation. And yet, beneath all the superstition, there was a grain of truth. Some herbs did repel insects. Lavender and mint kept fleas at bay, the very fleas spreading the Black Death. So by accident, the medievals were a little bit right. Even funerals had their own herbal traditions. Bodies were washed in vinegar and wrapped with sprigs of thyme and hyssop to mask decay and cleanse the soul. Graves were sprinkled with flowers not for beauty but for odour control. You might think the mourners were paying respect. In reality, they were just trying to survive the smell, and because this was the Middle Ages, someone inevitably tried to turn herbs into a miracle cure. Recipes for plague water circulated widely. Boil sage, rosemary, marigold, and wine together, then drink it daily to fortify your humours. The results were predictable: mild intoxication and a false sense of security. Apothecaries bottled the mixture and sold it by the gallon, proof that even in the 14th century marketing trumped science. Meanwhile, the truly devout added a religious spin. Some claimed certain herbs had been blessed by saints or grown on holy ground, imbuing them with divine protection. Others believed that each plant had a moral quality: rosemary for remembrance, thyme for courage, and basil for purity. Forget germ theory. You needed moral fibre and good seasoning. Looking back, the image of a terrified medieval villager clutching a fistful of herbs might seem absurd, but it's also deeply human. Faced with an invisible killer, they turned to what they could see, touch, and smell. The herbs gave them control, a sense that maybe they weren't completely helpless against the air itself. And in a way, they weren't wrong. The world still turns to scent for comfort. Candles, oils, diffusers, sprays are modern herbs packaged in glass and marketed as serenity. We may not fear miasma anymore, but we still believe that a little lavender can keep the darkness at bay. Maybe that's the one thing the Middle Ages got perfectly right. When the plague came, priests ordered incense burned in churches to drive away the evil vapours. Entire towns smelled like a candle shop explosion. Miraculously, it helped, mostly because everyone stayed home to avoid the smoke. In medieval Europe, the church was more than a place of worship. It was the Department of Public Health, Disaster Management, and spiritual pest control all rolled into one. When the world began to rot and cough, people didn't call doctors first, they called priests. The reasoning was simple. If bad air brought disease, then holy air must bring healing. And who better to manufacture holy air than the men who spent their days surrounded by it? Churches became centres of fumigation. Priests and monks burned incense by the cartload, frankincense, myrrh, sage, and anything else that could be set on fire without violating a commandment. The theory was that smoke carried blessings upward and bad air outward. The practice, however, turned cathedrals into asphyxiation chambers that could double as medieval smokehouses. Parishioners would stumble out red-eyed and wheezing but spiritually reassured. You smell sanctified, someone might say, and they'd mean it literally. The church's approach to air control wasn't just about perfume, it was about order. Bad smells meant sin, decay, and moral weakness. Sweet smells meant purity, holiness, and favour with God. So when the plague swept through towns, it wasn't just seen as a medical crisis, it was a moral one. The air was impure because souls were impure. Cleaning the air, therefore, meant cleaning hearts. Confession, prayer, and repentance were considered as vital as burning herbs or lighting candles. A plague doctor might bleed you, but a priest could absolve you, and in the Middle Ages, that was considered a stronger medicine. Some churches even hosted special air purification masses. Bells would ring, choirs would sing, and clouds of incense would rise until you couldn't see the altar through the fog. The priest would march up and down the aisles waving a censer like an exorcist trying to fight an invisible dragon. And in a sense, that's exactly what it was. A battle against the unseen. The faithful coughed, prayed, and sweated their way through services, believing every puff of scented smoke carried sin and sickness away. Outside the churches, the clergy took their crusade into the streets. Processions wound through cities, priests swinging incense burners as if fighting a slow-motion war against the sky itself. "Cleanse the air," they cried, trailing clouds of myrrh behind them. The effect was dramatic, but questionable. The smoke may have chased off miasma, but it definitely encouraged asthma. Still, the church's ritualistic fumigations had unintended benefits. The constant burning of incense helped mask the overwhelming stench of death that hung over medieval cities. It also kept flies, and sometimes even rats, at bay. Monasteries, with their strict cleaning routines and reliance on herbs and smoke, were statistically less plague-ridden than surrounding villages. So while the church may not have understood why it worked, it did, at least occasionally, make things less deadly. Then there was the soundscape of purification. Priests chanted psalms over smouldering braziers, their voices echoing through stone walls, the deep drone of Gregorian hymns mixed with the crackle of coals, creating an atmosphere that was equal parts holy and haunting. It was less a medical procedure and more a sensory experience, part spa, part sermon, part apocalypse. Of course, not everyone appreciated the holy smog. Some townsfolk grumbled that the priests were making things worse. "We're choking on salvation," they'd mutter as clouds of incense rolled down narrow streets. In one infamous case in Florence, so much incense was burned during a procession that several townspeople fainted from lack of oxygen. The clergy interpreted this as divine ecstasy, the townspeople less so. But whether out of faith, fear, or sheer olfactory exhaustion, people complied. Burning incense became as routine as prayer. Every parish had its signature scent and every home tried to imitate it. A little rosemary here, a pinch of sage there, just enough to feel protected. And while priests fought disease with holy smoke, ordinary citizens fought anxiety by copying them. The line between religion and medicine blurred completely until the church became Europe's most prolific air freshener manufacturer. By the time the plague waves finally receded, the habit stuck. Incense in churches became permanent, not because it warded off disease, but because it comforted the living. It masked decay, disguised fear, and made the unbearable world a little easier to breathe in. So yes, the church's grand plan to purify the air didn't cure the plague, but it gave people something else just as important, the illusion that someone, somewhere, was in control. When everything smelled like despair, they made it smell like heaven instead. And in a world where faith was sometimes the only medicine left, maybe that was miracle enough. The contradiction was peak medieval logic. Cover your face in roses while living beside a moat full of sewage. The streets ran with waste, but as long as your nostrils smelled jasmine, you were protected. Daily life in a medieval town was a full-body experience, mostly for your nose. The average street doubled as a trash chute, open drain, and sometimes a makeshift animal pen. But rather than fix the problem, by removing the waste, people decided to fight it with fashion. Enter the perfumed mask. These masks were the medieval version of, I can't see the problem if I can't smell it. Nobles carried silk handkerchiefs soaked in rosewater, merchants wore little scented sponges inside their collars, and travellers pressed perfumed cloths to their faces when passing through the poorer districts. Some even tied herbs directly under their noses, giving them the appearance of people constantly mid-nosebleed treatment. The logic was simple. If disease was carried by foul air, then good air, artificially generated, preferably floral, could keep it out. Of course, this made for some hilarious contradictions. You'd see a man in embroidered boots delicately sniffing a sachet of lavender while stepping over a pile of manure, or a wealthy lady dabbing perfume under her veil as a chamber pot was emptied from a second-story window. The sound of splashing was common background noise, so common in fact that city laws eventually had to specify which hours you were allowed to dump your waste. Spoiler, everyone ignored it. The problem wasn't that medieval people liked filth, they just didn't connect it to sickness. To them the stench was unpleasant, but not dangerous unless it came from someone else's house. Their solution was personal defence, not public hygiene, and so they invented ways to smell fabulous while standing ankle-deep in what historians politely call refuse. Perfume making became a booming industry. Apothecaries mixed concoctions of musk, rose oil, ambergris, yes, the whale kind, and even crushed pearls for the truly extravagant. Perfume wasn't a luxury, it was survival gear. The rich could afford imported scents from Italy and Arabia, subtle, expensive, and allegedly plague-proof. The poor made do with whatever was growing nearby. Mint, thyme, or, if times were rough, an onion stuffed in the pocket. Either way, everyone walked around enveloped in a cloud of overconfidence and mild nausea. But here's the fun twist. Their obsession with scent accidentally led to some minor improvements. As perfumed oils became common, people began washing their hands and faces more often, if only to apply the stuff. Gloves, too, were soaked in scented waters, which, though they didn't realise it, helped kill a few germs. The nobility even ordered rose-scented street cleanings, where servants would scatter petals in front of carriages. Sure, it didn't solve sanitation, but it made the city look like a romantic disaster movie. Still, the irony was brutal. Beneath the perfumed gloves and gilded masks, the streets reeked. Butchers dumped animal guts into gutters. Tanneries boiled hides in open vats of urine. The smell of unwashed humanity mixed with that of smoke, fish and horses, until the entire city became one giant sweaty soup of medieval ambition. You could locate a town by nose alone. Ah, yes, this must be Paris, travellers might say, fainting slightly. Yet, amid all that filth, the human instinct for elegance endured. People wore perfume not just to survive, but to pretend life was still civilised. A rose-scented mask was a small act of defiance, a floral middle finger to the stinking world around them. I may live above a cesspit, they thought, but I smell like paradise. And remarkably, the perfumed mask wasn't just for nobles. Even plague doctors stuffed their beaked masks with the same ingredients, lavender, cloves, and mint, proving that whether you were diagnosing death or avoiding it, smelling good was half the battle. In fact, the very word mask gained new meaning. It wasn't just about covering the face, but about denying reality. Eventually, as cities grew and the stench reached biblical proportions, some local leaders began experimenting with sanitation. They drained moats, built sewers, and outlawed dumping waste directly into the street, all while still burning incense and selling perfume. The miasma theory may have been wrong, but it motivated something useful. The first baby steps toward urban hygiene. In a way, the pursuit of sweet smells saved more lives than any doctor ever did. So yes, medieval towns were rancid, chaotic, and often ankle-deep in disease, but they also smelled faintly of roses. And that contradiction says everything about humanity. When the world falls apart, we reach for whatever comfort we can, even if it's just a handful of herbs and the delusion that we can perfume our way out of the apocalypse. Hospitals, such as they were, often smelled worse than the patients. Windows sealed, candles burning, 10 people to a bed. A single cough could start a symphony of wheezing. Nurses wiped fevers with wine-soaked cloths and whispered, "It's the bad air again." To call a medieval hospital a place of healing is generous. They were more like airless waiting rooms for the afterlife, with slightly better soup. The logic was consistent with the era. If bad air caused sickness, then keeping all air out must prevent it. So hospitals were built like fortresses against the wind, with thick stone walls and barely a slit for ventilation. Every breeze was a potential assassin, every open window a reckless invitation to death. Inside, the atmosphere could be described as concentrated humanity. Beds, if you could call piles of straw beds, were packed side by side, sometimes with multiple patients sharing the same blanket. The scent cocktail included sweat, tallow, incense and regret. Doctors shuffled from bed to bed, trailing the sweet tang of wine-soaked bandages, and a deep belief that the smell of alcohol alone could banish disease. Spoiler, it could not. The air was so thick with smoke and sickness that candles flickered weakly, as though even the flames were short of oxygen. Nurses, many of them nuns, worked tirelessly in this miasmic soup, wiping brows, muttering prayers and sprinkling holy water that quickly turned into holy steam. They were told that drafts could drive the fever deeper into the body, so windows stayed sealed. The result? The fever stayed, the body left. Hospitals were often attached to monasteries, which meant care came with a heavy dose of religion. Healing wasn't so much about fighting germs, nobody knew those existed, as it was about balancing the humours and purifying the soul. Doctors prescribed bleeding, purging, or, for the truly unlucky, both. The groans of patients mixed with the droning of hymns, creating an atmosphere that was equal parts medical procedure and ghost story. Wine was the miracle cure of choice. It cleaned wounds, cooled fevers, and most importantly numbed everyone's sense of smell. Physicians dabbed it on ulcers, poured it into mouths, and occasionally drank it in solidarity. For disinfectant purposes, of course. Some hospitals went through barrels of the stuff weekly, which probably made them more popular than they deserved. If you were dying, at least you could die slightly tipsy. And yet, despite the horrors, hospitals did have a system. Patients were separated, not by illness, but by social rank. Nobles got the cleanest linens and closest beds to the window, though the window was nailed shut. The poor were lined up near the door, presumably for easier disposal. Surgery was performed in the same rooms where people were eating, praying, and occasionally expiring, meaning the air was filled with both devotion and open wounds. The medieval fear of corrupted air also meant doctors obsessed over smell. They carried pomanders, little metal orbs stuffed with herbs and spices, and waved them dramatically over patients like tiny censer balls. If the room smelled bad, they burned incense until it smelled worse, and if that didn't work, they blamed sin. A successful diagnosis required equal parts theology and olfactory endurance. Interestingly, some hospitals weren't all doom. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, for example, was famous for its charity, and infamous for its ventilation. Chroniclers described the air as heavy and hot with breath and rot, a description that makes modern hospitals feel like day spas. Yet even there, amid the suffocating atmosphere, the staff truly believed they were saving lives. They prayed, they cleaned, sort of, and they believed that sealing the windows kept the death vapours at bay. Of course, reality was crueler. The closed rooms turned hospitals into perfect breeding grounds for infection. Diseases spread faster than the gossip about who'd survived the night. Patients arrived with a fever and left with 3 new ones. But to the medieval mind, this wasn't proof that their methods were wrong. It was proof that the air outside was even worse. Still, there's something strangely admirable about it. These were people working blind, fighting invisible enemies with nothing but faith, wine, and sheer stubbornness. They didn't know that opening a window could have saved lives, but in their candlelit wards, as prayers mingled with coughing and incense choked the rafters, they did the best they could with the knowledge they had. So the next time you walk into a clean ventilated hospital with automatic doors and hand sanitizer, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. Because once upon a time, the cure for bad air was simply less air. To purify rooms, people burned sulphur, pitch, or old shoes. The smoke was considered healing, though it mostly caused choking, blindness, and regret. Doctors insisted it was working. Patients disagreed between coughing fits. Welcome to the medieval version of spring cleaning, where the goal wasn't to make your house smell nice. It was to convince the air to stop killing you. The theory was simple and horrifyingly wrong. If disease came from bad air, then stronger air, smoky, eye-watering, room-clearing air, could drive it out. And thus began the centuries-long European tradition of setting things on fire indoors for health reasons. The process usually started with sulphur, the darling of medieval disinfection. A handful of powder tossed into a brazier would fill the room with thick, acrid fumes, the kind that could peel paint and make the saints cry. It was believed that sulphur's pungent scent purged evil vapours and sanctified the air. In practice, it also purged the ability to breathe. Entire families sat huddled in smoke-filled homes, coughing heroically and muttering prayers, convinced that every wheeze was proof of success. Pitch, resin, and tar followed closely behind in popularity. These substances burned hot, slow and dirty, coating the rafters in soot while releasing a cocktail of toxic fumes. Medieval manuals even recommended closing the doors and windows tight while doing it, trapping the smoke inside like a fumigation chamber designed by someone who hated lungs. The result? 1 part air purification, 3 parts carbon monoxide poisoning. And if you were too poor to buy fancy substances like sulphur or pitch, don't worry. The medieval guidebook of questionable wisdom had you covered. Burn old leather shoes. The smell was atrocious, somewhere between despair and barbecue, but to the medieval mind, the worse it smelled, the better it worked. Evil air fears foul smoke, they said, which, if true, means evil air probably moved to another village out of sheer disgust. Fires weren't just for disease control, they were also part of routine maintenance. Peasants burned straw, dung, or wood chips in their cottages to drive out dampness and refresh the air. Unfortunately, those small homes had 1 chimney, if that, so all the refreshing stayed right there in the living room. The blackened ceilings of surviving medieval cottages tell the tale. Centuries of health-conscious indoor bonfires that turned lungs into leather. Doctors encouraged it naturally. Physicians would walk through smoky rooms nodding sagely, declaring, "Yes, the air is much improved," before stepping outside for further observation. Some even prescribed daily fumigations, where herbs were tossed into a pot and burned while the patient sat nearby inhaling the vapours. It sounds vaguely spa-like until you realise the herbs often included camphor, arsenic and sometimes, for reasons no one explained, dried frog parts. Religious leaders joined the effort too, mixing faith and fire in one convenient ritual. Churches were fumigated before major masses, monasteries filled with the scent of burning juniper, and plague victims' homes were cleansed with holy smoke. A monk might stand in a doorway waving incense and shouting Latin blessings, while the family inside tried not to pass out. "The Lord purifies all things," he'd declare, coughing slightly. What's fascinating is that occasionally this madness worked, not for the reasons they thought, but by accident. Some herbs like rosemary, thyme and sage did repel insects and purify the air slightly. The problem was the medieval tendency to take every good idea and crank it to 11. If a little smoke was good, a room full of it must be divine. By the late Middle Ages, fumigation had evolved into a social event. Town officials organised massive citywide burnings when plagues hit. Bonfires blazed in every square, billowing with fragrant herbs, hay, and occasionally questionable materials like old furniture or dead animals. The entire town would disappear into a fog bank of healing vapour, coughing in unison while declaring the experiment a success. Some people even believed that smoke could teach the air manners. After a particularly nasty epidemic in Florence, one chronicler wrote that the citizens smoked the city clean, and the heavens themselves took note. The heavens likely took note of the smog. In hindsight, it's easy to laugh, or cough, at their efforts. But beneath the absurdity lay a very human truth. People were desperate to feel in control. The plague was invisible, the air unpredictable, and the doctors mostly ornamental. Fire gave them something tangible to fight back with. When the world stank of death, at least they could make it stink on their own terms. So next time you light a scented candle or run an air purifier, remember, you're following a very old tradition. Just be grateful that modern science swapped sulphur and burning shoes for lavender and electricity. The medievals may have smoked themselves silly, but in their own ashy way they paved the path for every air freshener aisle in existence. When in doubt, remove blood. Leeches were the ultimate cure-all. The logic? Less blood, fewer humours to be poisoned by the air. Patients left dizzy, pale, and slightly less full of regrets for about 2 days. In the grand medical buffet of medieval Europe, leeches were the main course. Doctors loved them, apothecaries sold them by the jar, and patients didn't get a vote. The philosophy was simple and terrifying. The body's health depended on balancing 4 mysterious fluids called humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you got sick, it wasn't germs, it was your fluids being dramatic. The cure? Remove some blood until the rest of you stopped misbehaving. Leeches were the medieval multi-tool. Headache? Apply leeches. Fever? Leeches? Possessed by demons? Maybe a few extra leeches just in case. They were prescribed for everything from toothaches to heartbreak, and if you survived the treatment you were considered cured, mostly because the doctor had already been paid. The procedure was equal parts science and horror show. A doctor, or more often a barber with ambitions, would arrive with a small wooden box filled with wriggling medical equipment. He'd open the lid dramatically, revealing a handful of fat, shiny leeches slithering around like sentient spaghetti. Then he'd pick one up, wet and eager, and place it carefully on your skin. The leech would sniff around for a good vein, latch on, and start feeding like it just found the medieval version of an all-you-can-eat buffet. To the patient, the sensation was unsettling. First, a cold tickle, then a slow pull, like your soul being sipped through a straw. Bloodletting sessions could last an hour or more, and a good leech could drink up to 10 times its own weight before dropping off, bloated and self-satisfied. "Ah, the balance is restored," the doctor would say, as his patient wobbled dangerously between light-headed and lightless. It's easy to mock now, but in a world that didn't understand infection, leeches seemed logical. People could see the bad blood leaving their bodies. The relief, however temporary, felt real. After all, if you're dizzy and half-conscious, your fever feels less important. Medieval doctors mistook that for progress. The patient no longer complains, they'd note proudly, unaware that the patient had simply fainted. The popularity of leeches spread across all social classes. The rich imported rare species from distant swamps, while peasants fetched their own from local ponds. Apothecaries kept jars of them on counters, and children were occasionally sent to collect fresh supplies. A truly traumatizing summer job. Monks used leeches in monasteries, where healing through bleeding took on both medical and theological meaning. After all, didn't Christ also suffer blood loss for humanity's salvation? A little bleeding was practically holy. Some physicians took the practice to wild extremes. Chronic illnesses were treated with repeated bloodlettings over weeks, sometimes removing a full quarter of a person's total volume. The results were predictable. Patients grew weak, pale, and sometimes fatally balanced. But the doctors interpreted that as the disease leaving the body. In fairness, it wasn't entirely wrong. The life left too. Leech therapy wasn't all superstition, though. In certain cases, like reducing bruising or relieving pressure, it worked accidentally. Leeches secreted anticoagulants that improved circulation, a fact medieval doctors noticed but didn't understand. They just thought it was divine approval. "See how the wound keeps bleeding after the leech falls off," they'd say. "The body expels the evil." In reality, the patient was just running out of bandages. Hospitals kept leeching rooms with buckets of murky water filled with little writhing healers. Doctors would walk in like sommeliers, inspecting them carefully before selecting the finest vintage for their patients. The best leeches were said to come from marshes in Wales, where they were strong and enthusiastic. One chronicler even claimed that Welsh leeches could sense sin, biting sinners more eagerly, an unfortunate reputation for both the Welsh and the leeches. When a leech had done its duty, it was either thrown out or reused, sometimes on another patient. The concept of cross-contamination didn't exist yet, but plague bacteria certainly did. So while medieval doctors thought they were cleansing the body, they were often just swapping one person's germs for another's. Think of it as the early prototype for a group health plan, minus the benefits. And still, the fascination persisted for centuries. Even as medical science evolved, leeches refused to go out of style. By the 18th century, France alone imported millions every year. In some cities, leech shortages caused near riots. Imagine a world where people panic because the blood-sucking worms are sold out. In a strange twist, leeches eventually earned scientific redemption. Today, they're used in microsurgery to restore blood flow, their ancient reputation vindicated by modern medicine. So, yes, medieval doctors were wildly wrong about why leeches worked, but they weren't entirely wrong that they did. It's comforting in a darkly comic way. Even in an age of superstition, people clung to anything that offered hope, even if it also offered anemia. So next time you get queasy at the sight of a blood test, remember, somewhere in the 14th century a peasant sat quietly while 6 leeches enjoyed lunch on his face, all in the name of science. Parents warned children not to sleep near cracks in the wall. Drafts were thought to invite death spirits. So everyone bundled up in thick blankets, sweating in smoky darkness, slowly inventing the world's first sauna by accident. The medieval world had many fears: plague, famine, invading armies, but few things terrified people more than a cool breeze. Fresh air was not refreshing. It was suspicious. A gentle wind through a window wasn't nature being kind. It was a messenger of doom. To the medieval mind, drafts carried invisible killers, demonic vapours, and general misfortune. You could be perfectly healthy one night, feel a breeze touch your neck, and by morning your neighbours would be dividing your chickens. So people barricaded themselves against the air like it was an enemy army. Windows were covered in cloth, shutters nailed shut, and gaps stuffed with straw, rags, or even dung if you ran out of ideas. A well-sealed home was considered a mark of good sense, the kind of place where no rogue breeze could slip in to rearrange your humours. The result was a kind of medieval terrarium, hot, humid, and thick with the smell of humanity, livestock and regret. Bedtime was an Olympic sport of suffocation prevention. Families piled on layers of blankets, cloaks, and whatever vaguely fabric-like material they could find. Curtains hung heavy around beds to trap warmth and block out drafts. The famous 4-poster bed was less about luxury and more about survival through insulation. Couples, children, and sometimes even guests slept together for warmth, turning the medieval bed into a crowded, sweaty ecosystem of snoring, wheezing, and whispered prayers that the roof didn't leak. Parents passed their fear of drafts down like a family heirloom. Mothers would scold children for sleeping near walls, whispering tales of death breezes that entered through cracks to steal your life in your sleep. Catching a cold wasn't caused by germs, it was taking the air. Sneezing was basically proof that you'd been assaulted by the atmosphere. So if you ever wondered why medieval portraits show people wearing layers indoors, now you know they weren't making a fashion statement. They were waging war against wind. Even doctors joined in. Medical texts warned that sudden changes in air temperature could disturb the humours and invite illness. Patients recovering from fevers were ordered to remain in closed rooms, sweating out their sickness under piles of furs. Opening a window was considered reckless, the 14th century equivalent of licking a subway pole. If you wanted to get better, you stayed hot, still, and miserable. Better to suffocate a little, one physician wrote, than to invite the cold. That could have been the unofficial slogan of medieval healthcare. Homes themselves were built with this fear in mind. Small windows, thick walls, and low ceilings were all intentional, designed to trap heat and unfortunately everything else. The hearth in the centre of the room belched smoke into the air, coating beams in soot and lungs in phlegm. But rather than vent the smoke, people welcomed it as a kind of protection. Smoke keeps sickness away, they believed. It drives out demons. Maybe it did, but it also drove out oxygen. By nightfall, the air inside a medieval home was so thick you could almost chew it. The scent of stew, sweat, wood smoke, and wet wool blended into something uniquely horrifying. Yet people found comfort in it. To them that oppressive warmth felt safe. It meant no cold spirits, no evil drafts, no miasma sneaking in from the fields. Just the familiar stink of survival. Of course, not everyone agreed. Some travellers and scholars who'd visited warmer, more open parts of the world returned to Europe with wild tales. They opened their windows. They let air in. The reaction was pure horror. Opening a window at night was the medieval equivalent of running naked through a cemetery. One chronicler even described a man who slept with his shutters open during a plague outbreak. A week later, he was dead. Never mind that the plague had killed everyone else too. The open window got the blame. There were even social rituals around managing airflow. Before bed, households would perform a kind of draft inspection. Servants would check walls and doorways for gaps, hang extra cloth over suspicious corners, and make sure every member of the family was properly swaddled. It was less turn-down service and more anti-air exorcism. Some wealthy households even hired specialists, air wardens, to ensure that no dangerous breeze disrupted the night. Ironically, by trapping all that heat, medieval people did indeed create a kind of primitive sauna. Winters meant endless sweating indoors, leading to dehydration, fainting, and the occasional small fire when someone's blanket got too close to the hearth. But nobody complained, at least not loudly enough to suggest opening a window. Looking back, their fear makes a strange kind of sense. They didn't know about germs or bacteria, but they did know that people got sick after being outside. They associated cold air with death because the sick often shivered, and the dying often cooled before the end. Cold kills, they reasoned, and so warmth became safety. So as you tuck yourself into your cosy, well-ventilated bedroom tonight, maybe whisper a quiet thank you to your ancestors, the brave souls who survived centuries of self-imposed sauna life just to make sure you could one day enjoy a breeze without fear. And if you feel a gentle draft on your neck, don't worry, it's not a death spirit. Probably, not everyone agreed, some daring thinkers, mostly people named after birds or saints, suggested that maybe, just maybe, opening a window wouldn't kill you. They were laughed at. Some even lost their medical licenses for being air heretics. In the tightly sealed world of medieval medicine, suggesting that air could be good for you was about as scandalous as saying the Earth wasn't the centre of the universe. The ventilation rebels, as history would later call them, though not kindly, were the first people brave enough to challenge centuries of windowless wisdom. They dared to ask the unthinkable, what if breathing wasn't the problem? The earliest troublemakers were physicians who noticed something odd. Patients who spent time outside sometimes got better. Not always, of course. Some died dramatically just to prove the church right. But others improved, and that made people nervous. If air wasn't evil, what else might the church be wrong about? Cue dramatic Gregorian chanting. One of these rebels was John of the Window, not his real name, but it might as well have been, a 14th century scholar who suggested that stagnant air might be harmful. His proposal, open a window briefly each morning to let out foul vapours. The medical community's reaction was swift and smoky. His peers accused him of inviting pestilence into the home, and he was promptly banned from practicing medicine until he agreed to stop promoting reckless airflow. Other thinkers, often monks with access to old Greek texts, rediscovered ancient ideas about air circulation from Hippocrates and Galen. These ancients had said that fresh air was necessary for health, but medieval Europe had long since swapped that advice for incense and paranoia, so when a few monks started quoting Hippocrates again, people panicked. "Heresy!" cried the doctors. "Hellenic nonsense!" cried the priests. "I can't breathe!" cried everyone else. The rebellion wasn't confined to scholars. Housewives and midwives joined in too. Some began opening doors during childbirth, believing the mother needed the breath of life. Others placed sick children near open slits in the wall, claiming the air tempted the illness to flee. Their neighbours saw this and thought they had lost their minds. A few even accused them of witchcraft, because in medieval logic, only sorcery could make someone think wind was helpful. Still, whispers spread. Travellers returning from southern Europe described cities with open courtyards and breezy homes. They breathe freely in Italy, one Englishman wrote, and yet they live. The response from his countrymen was predictable. Yes, but they smell like garlic. Cultural pride survived where reason did not. By the Renaissance, the tide began to shift, slowly, like a window creaking open after centuries of rust. New thinkers, armed with early scientific tools and far too much confidence, began observing air itself. They noticed that foul odours didn't always mean disease, and that plague didn't respect closed shutters. One physician, Theophrastus Bombastus Paracelsus, a man whose name was as dramatic as his ideas, declared, "What is poison but a question of dosage?" In other words, maybe not all air was bad, just the concentrated stuff. The true ventilation revolution, however, came with architecture. By the 16th century, city planners and wealthy patrons began commissioning airy designs. Windows grew larger, chimneys more functional, and courtyards reappeared. The elite congratulated themselves for rediscovering the wisdom of light and air, as if peasants hadn't been breathing outdoors for centuries. Still, it marked a turning point, the slow return of oxygen to European interiors. Of course, not everyone embraced it. Some conservative doctors clung to the miasma theory like a comforting blanket, ironically a suffocating one. They dismissed the ventilation crowd as reckless experimenters and blamed them for every new outbreak. "See," they'd say when someone caught a cold, "that's what happens when you let the devil's wind inside." But the rebellion had momentum. Hospitals began testing ventilation systems, crude holes punched into ceilings or walls, and found that patients sometimes lived longer. Coincidence? Asked traditionalists. Causation! Shouted the air enthusiasts, triumphantly flinging open more windows. By the 17th century, opening a window was no longer witchcraft. It was modern medicine. And yet, even as science advanced, the old fear lingered. Mothers still warned their children to avoid drafts. Old men still sealed up windows for health. Tradition, after all, dies slower than the people it endangers. Looking back, the ventilation rebellion wasn't just about air. It was about daring to challenge fear with logic. These early thinkers didn't just open windows, they cracked open the medieval mind. They proved that sometimes progress begins not with fire or blood or herbs, but with a single gust of courage and a willingness to breathe it in. Royalty didn't escape the madness. Kings filled halls with lavender sachets and ordered servants to wave fans of peacock feathers soaked in wine. The smell of luxury and fear was unmistakable. In the medieval arms race against foul air, the nobles didn't fight with sense, they fought with scent. If the commoners stuffed herbs in their shirts, the royals wanted cathedrals worth of fragrance. Castles became perfumed fortresses where every corridor reeked of desperation and expensive flowers. It wasn't about hygiene, it was about hierarchy. The richer you were, the more aggressively you could pretend the air didn't apply to you. Royal physicians insisted that sweet vapours could protect the powerful from disease. So monarchs filled their chambers with aromatics: lavender, rose petals, musk, ambergris, and anything else that smelled like money. Courtiers didn't just dab perfume on their wrists, they bathed in it. Queen Isabella of Castile supposedly soaked her gloves in rosewater daily, and some French nobles wore perfume-soaked ribbons under their wigs, just to ensure that their heads, if not their morals, stayed fresh. The obsession reached architectural levels. Palaces were designed with scent in mind, not for ventilation of course, but for fragrance delivery. Servants burned incense in corners, placed bowls of crushed flowers on window ledges, and sprinkled rosewater on the floors before banquets. The result was an olfactory onslaught, a dizzying blend of musk, sweat, and decaying meat from the feast table, but to the royal nose that mix smelled like health. King Louis XV of France reportedly forbade anyone with a disagreeable odour from entering his presence. To qualify for court, one had to be politically loyal, properly dressed, and aggressively perfumed. The irony? Louis lived in a castle with open sewers and a moat that doubled as a garbage dump. Outside, the air could have stripped paint. Inside, it was just as deadly, as it smelled faintly of violets. Perfume became both armour and social signal. Nobles carried ornate pomanders, small metal orbs filled with herbs, spices, and occasionally ground gems, because why not? The most fashionable ones were shaped like fruit or skulls, dangling from chains at their waists, ready to be sniffed at the first whiff of mortality. When plague rumours spread, these pomanders grew in size until they resembled small cannonballs. Imagine a ballroom full of nobles waving jewelled spheres at their faces like frightened bees. History's most fragrant panic attack. Then came the perfumed fans. Made of silk, lace, or peacock feathers, these were dipped in wine or rosewater and waved constantly before royal noses. The theory was simple. If air moved, it must be filtered by wealth. At court gatherings, the sound of rustling fans blended with gossip and candle crackle, creating an atmosphere that was part masquerade, part mass delusion. Of course, these extravagant precautions didn't actually work. The Black Death struck princes and paupers alike, but that didn't stop the upper class from doubling down. When the royal apothecaries ran out of imported perfume, they invented new blends using whatever they could find: violets, vinegar, and occasionally animal fat. One especially ill-fated recipe called for essence of civet, a musky oil secreted by a small cat-like creature. It worked, if your goal was to smell like both a funeral and a zoo. The royal obsession with scent also trickled down, literally. The floors of noble halls were often strewn with rushes, dried reeds or straw, mixed with herbs and flowers. As guests walked across them, the heat of footsteps released fragrance into the air. Unfortunately, those same rushes trapped food scraps, fleas and rat droppings. After a few weeks, the aromatic flooring was basically compost. But as long as it smelled vaguely floral, no one complained. Even royal garments were weapons in the war against foul air. Cloaks and gowns were lined with sachets of herbs, and wigs were dusted with perfumed powder. Some nobles wore scent armour, padded vests stuffed with herbs like rosemary and mint. When disease crept through the streets, they walked confidently, believing their portable gardens would keep death at bay. It didn't, of course, but at least they looked fabulous while coughing. Servants bore the brunt of this fragrant madness. Their job wasn't just to clean, but to refresh. They boiled perfume in pots, burned incense at dawn, and sprayed linen with scented wine. Some even had to carry censers around their masters as they walked, like human air fresheners. The royal court must have looked like a cross between a religious procession and a candle store on fire. In hindsight, the nobles' obsession with outsmelling death was both ridiculous and strangely poignant. They lived in a world where power couldn't buy understanding, where kings were as terrified of air as the peasants who served them. Their perfumes were armour against the unknown, a way to declare, "I control my world," even as the invisible forces of disease whispered otherwise. So yes, medieval nobles tried to perfume their way through pandemics, and failed spectacularly, but in their desperation, they left behind something enduring: the world's first luxury fragrance industry. The next time you spritz cologne before a night out, remember, you're participating in a 1,000-year-old tradition of trying, in vain, to smell better than death. Peasants couldn't afford herbs or wine baths. Their cure for bad air was mud, literally. Rub it on, block the pores, seal the sickness out. Did it work? Absolutely not. But it made for a strong conversation piece at funerals. For the lower classes, surviving the Middle Ages was less about medicine and more about creative stubbornness. While nobles bathed in rosewater and waved scented fans at invisible death clouds, peasants took a more direct approach. If the bad air couldn't get in, maybe you could trap yourself inside your own skin. The result was an entire population walking around partially coated in what can only be described as medicinal sludge. The practice came from equal parts folklore, desperation and observation, though observation here meant something someone's cousin swore worked once. Farmers believed that mud, clay, or even soot could protect against sickness by forming a physical barrier. Some even added animal fat or ashes to make the coating stronger. The logic was grimly beautiful in its simplicity. The air was evil, the skin was holy, and mud was the wall between the two. And if you think they only used a little, no. People slathered it on thick like armour. Shepherds trudged into the fields with clay-caked faces, and children played in mud puddles not just for fun, but because their parents thought it made them untempting to death. To modernise, it sounds absurd. To medieval peasants, it was good parenting. Dirt, after all, was free, and unlike doctors, it didn't ask for payment or blame you for dying wrong. When disease swept through a village, peasants didn't summon physicians. They couldn't afford one anyway. They turned to home remedies that involved generous helpings of earth, smoke, and prayer. Mud was applied to skin. Soot was rubbed on door frames to confuse evil spirits. Some even filled bowls with dirt and placed them beside their beds as air traps. The morning ritual involved checking whether the dirt had darkened overnight, proof, they believed, that it had absorbed sickness while they slept. Bathing was rare, both for lack of resources and because, paradoxically, it was thought dangerous. Washing opened the pores, and open pores were invitations for bad air, so instead of washing off the grime, people added more. In a sense, the peasant body became a medieval hazmat suit made of filth and faith. It's no wonder chroniclers often described peasants as earth-scented. That wasn't poetic license. It was olfactory fact. Occasionally more creative cures appeared. In some regions, villagers baked mud into small cakes. which they'd press against their foreheads or chests to draw out poison. Others carried small pouches of soil from churchyards, believing consecrated dirt had protective power. If you were especially devout, you might even mix your mud with holy water. That way, if you still died, at least your corpse was halfway blessed. Animals joined the regimen too. Farmers noticed pigs rolling in mud and assumed they must know something. "Be as the pig, and thou shalt be clean," one proverb allegedly went, which tells you everything about medieval logic. Pigs, of course, rolled in mud to cool off, not to ward off plague, but the peasants didn't care. If swine survived longer than humans, clearly the pigs were onto something. There were moments when this earthy superstition actually provided accidental benefits. Mud could soothe burns, keep insects away, and offer minimal protection against sun and wind. Unfortunately, it also trapped bacteria and infected open wounds, turning minor scratches into major funerals. Yet because everyone smelled like damp soil anyway, few noticed until it was too late. Meanwhile, local wise women, the closest thing most villagers had to doctors, prescribed all kinds of dirt-based concoctions. Eat a spoon of clean soil each morning, one might say. It will settle the humours. Or bury your shoes overnight in the field so the earth may drink your illness. If those failed, and they always did, she might shrug and declare, "The spirits are strong this year." Despite the obvious inefficacy, the belief persisted for centuries. The poor didn't have the luxury of disbelief. They needed something to cling to, even if it was a handful of mud. When plagues hit, they sealed their huts, smeared the walls, and prayed that the ground they tilled by day would protect them by night. It rarely worked, but it gave them comfort. And when you lived in a world where medicine was a rumour, comfort was the closest thing to a cure. Ironically, modern science would later confirm that exposure to certain microbes in soil can actually boost immunity. So in the strangest possible way, those mud-covered peasants might have had the barest sliver of an accidental advantage. Not enough to survive the plague, but enough to make history giggle from the afterlife. So yes, while kings perfumed their way through paranoia and doctors bled their patients dry, the poor fought invisible death with the only weapon they had, dirt. And though it didn't save them, there's something weirdly poetic about that image. Humanity's eternal faith that even when the world is rotten, maybe, just maybe, the earth itself can protect us. When people noticed that gravediggers, who worked outside all day, rarely got sick, some questioned the fresh air is deadly theory. Doctors responded by calling it coincidence, or witchcraft, always one or the other. It started quietly, a few whispers in taverns, muttered questions in crowded markets. If fresh air was dangerous, why were the people who spent all day in it still alive? The gravediggers, the farmers, the shepherds, the ones knee-deep in death and manure, somehow seemed healthier than the nobles who sealed themselves in perfumed tombs of luxury. But questioning the medical establishment of the Middle Ages was like challenging the church, dangerous, and guaranteed to earn you either a fine, a curse, or an exorcism. Doctors of the time, armed with Latin phrases and an unshakable confidence, refused to let mere observation ruin centuries of theory. The gravediggers, they'd scoff, protected by divine grace. Or, if that didn't fit the mood, they've made a pact with the devil. Anything but the obvious, that maybe the air outside wasn't the problem at all. The logic went like this: bad air killed, therefore anyone who survived must have supernatural resistance. A peasant could work beside an open pit of corpses without falling ill, and doctors would nod gravely. He is cursed, they'd say. His soul is unclean, and thus the spirits spare him for now. It's hard to win an argument when your opponent thinks health is evidence of damnation. Still, common sense refused to die. A few midwives and herbalists began noting patterns, how open-air recovery seemed to help certain ailments, especially fevers. "Let the breeze touch the brow," one old woman said, "and the fever walks away." For her trouble, she was accused of consorting with wind spirits. Meanwhile, the learned men continued locking patients in unventilated rooms and wondering why they kept dying. The divide between doctors and the public grew wider every year. Physicians clung to their books and their humours, blood, bile, phlegm and melancholy, while ordinary people trusted what they saw with their own eyes. "Fresh air revives," said the farmers. "Fresh air kills," said the doctors. It was a battle between evidence and ego was winning by a landslide. Medical guilds, terrified of losing authority, even issued decrees warning citizens against reckless exposure to winds. Some cities passed ordinances banning the opening of shutters during plagues. Meanwhile, gravediggers continued their work outdoors, whistling, coughing occasionally, but mostly fine. It was almost as if reality itself were mocking the profession. The irony deepened when the doctors began catching the very diseases they claimed to understand. Many treated patients indoors for hours, breathing the same safe air. When they inevitably fell ill, they doubled down on the theory. The air within is pure, they'd gasp between coughs. It must have been the demons. Even the clergy joined in, declaring that God favoured the humble worker with earthly immunity as a test of faith. So now, instead of revising their methods, doctors blamed theology. The poor were healthy because of God's mercy. The rich were sick because of God's lesson. Either way, nobody had to admit that their ideas about air were nonsense. It took centuries and a few brave iconoclasts to start turning the tide. Early natural philosophers began measuring, observing, even sniffing the problem scientifically. Some realised that diseases spread not through air itself, but through contact and contaminated objects. Yet even then, doctors resisted. Soiled linens cause sickness, they scoffed. Absurd. Next, you'll tell me invisible creatures live on them. But the stubborn persistence of common sense couldn't be contained forever. When outbreaks began hitting enclosed monasteries and leaving open-air workers untouched, the truth grew impossible to ignore. Slowly, quietly, physicians began performing their own experiments. A cracked window here, a patient's bed moved closer to a draft there. Some saw results. They didn't publish them, of course. That would be heresy, but they noticed. Eventually, air stopped being the enemy. Not because doctors declared it so, but because reality wore them down. Too many patients had died in suffocating rooms while peasants outside continued to thrive. The witchcraft theory lost its charm when the witches outlived the healers. Looking back, doctors versus common sense was never just about medicine. It was about the human tendency to defend ego over evidence. The people closest to the earth trusted what they saw, while the educated elite trusted what they'd read centuries before. In a world where truth reeked of manure and survival looked unrefined, common sense was the truest heresy of all. And in the end, it won. Not through debate or discovery, but through the quiet persistence of those who simply refused to stop breathing. Ironically, one of the few effective ideas of the era came from the same fear. Ships arriving from plague-infested regions were made to wait 40 days, 40 giorni, just to let the bad air settle. Accidentally, they invented quarantine. It was perhaps the first time fear and practicality stumbled into a partnership that actually worked. Picture this: the 14th century Mediterranean, where trade ships were the medieval equivalent of airplanes. Fast, full of goods, and absolutely teeming with disease. Cities like Venice and Dubrovnik were bustling hubs of commerce and contagion. The Black Death was the uninvited passenger no one could deport, and every new ship on the horizon was both a promise of profit and a floating coffin. The logic, as usual, was drenched in miasma theory. People didn't yet understand bacteria, but they did understand patterns. Sick ships arrived, towns got sick. Ships waited offshore for a while, and sometimes towns didn't. The conclusion: the bad air just needed time to cool off. No one realised it wasn't air that was cooling. It was the infected people dying before disembarking. Grim, yes, but scientifically effective in the most medieval way possible. The number 40 wasn't random. It came from both practical observation and religious symbolism. The Bible mentioned 40 days so often. The flood, Jesus in the desert, Moses on the mountain, that people assumed it was a divinely approved waiting period. If 40 days was good enough for the Lord, reasoned the Venetian health boards, it's good enough for us, and thus divine superstition became public health policy. Venetian harbour masters took quarantine seriously. Ships suspected of carrying plague were ordered to anchor at designated islands, essentially early isolation wards surrounded by seagulls and despair. Guards patrolled the shore, ensuring no one sneaked off early for a quick espresso or confession. On board, sailors either recovered or didn't. Supplies were lowered down with ropes, and letters were fumigated with smoke before anyone dared touch them. If the crew survived 40 days, the ship was allowed to dock. If not, well, fewer rats to worry about. This practice soon spread across Europe. In Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, the 1377 plague regulations were revolutionary. Travellers and goods alike were isolated for 30 days in a Trentino. When 30 proved a little optimistic, they extended it to 40, and the quarantine was officially born. These weren't gentle retreats, though. Quarantine stations, called lazarettos, were grim stone fortresses perched on rocky islands. Inside, the air was thick with incense vinegar fumes and the occasional existential dread of a sailor counting his last sunsets. Doctors naturally claimed credit. They declared that the enforced waiting allowed the corrupted vapours to disperse into the firmament. What actually dispersed were fleas, the true culprits, but nobody noticed because everyone was too busy burning herbs and writing about the spiritual significance of clean air. Yet, despite being based on flawed science, quarantine worked. Towns that enforced it saw fewer outbreaks. The death tolls dipped, and even the most sceptical merchants began to see reason. Sure, it delayed trade and profits, but what good was gold if you couldn't breathe long enough to spend it? Slowly, fear of bad air transformed into something surprisingly useful: organised, state-enforced disease control. The first lazarettos eventually became models for modern hospitals and border control. Venice's Lazaretto Vecchio was a pioneer, half infirmary, half prison, all caution. The city even established health passports, documents certifying that travellers had survived their 40 days. It was the medieval version of a negative COVID test, minus the nasal swab and plus a touch of divine panic. Of course, not everyone approved. Merchants complained about lost income, sailors rioted for shore leave, and some citizens accused the authorities of spreading disease by trapping sickness at sea. Conspiracy theories were alive and well, handwritten, ink-stained, and shouted in marketplaces. But as plague waves continued to devastate Europe, the policy endured, because nothing motivates compliance like the sight of an entire neighbourhood turning into a cemetery. Over time, quarantine evolved from an emergency response into a standard precaution. Whenever rumours of pestilence arose, cities shut their gates, rang their bells, and hung warning flags from the harbour. The colour yellow became synonymous with contagion. In a way, it was the world's first international safety protocol, a shared agreement that fear, properly managed, could save lives. And perhaps that's the strangest part of all. The same society that thought fresh air could kill you also stumbled upon one of the most enduring medical practices in human history. Out of superstition and panic came structure, rules, and an early glimmer of epidemiology. They didn't know what they were preventing, only that it worked, and in the chaos of the 14th century that was more than enough. So yes, medieval medicine gave us leeches, smoke baths, and bird masks, but it also gave us quarantine, proof that even when history is at its most ridiculous, sometimes through sheer accident, it manages to save itself. People wore extra layers to guard against poisoned breezes. Heavy cloaks, gloves, and even veils in summer heat. The result? Overheating, fainting, and occasionally spontaneous self-roasting. To the medieval mind, the body was a fortress, and the air was a besieging army. The only defence? Fabric. Thick, itchy, suffocating fabric. Forget silk pyjamas and breathable linen. The average medieval citizen dressed like they were preparing for a snowstorm inside a sauna. Doctors told them that layers would seal the humours and protect them from disease, so they obeyed. If the plague was in town, everyone looked like a cross between a winter night and a nervous burrito. The obsession with covering up began with the same fear that ruled everything else: bad air. Since illness was thought to float invisibly through the atmosphere, touching skin was practically a death sentence. So, men wrapped scarves around their faces, women doubled their veils, and even children were swaddled until they resembled bread loaves. Peasants might not have been able to afford fine fabrics, but they compensated with creativity, layering burlap sacks, wool tunics, and anything vaguely resembling a barrier. Of course, ventilation wasn't exactly a fashion priority. In the height of summer, streets filled with people wobbling under their own clothes, sweat dripping into shoes, smelling like boiled cabbage and regret. Fainting became a national pastime. If someone collapsed in public, no one rushed to help. They just assumed the bad air got them. Ironically, removing a layer might have saved lives, but that was far too radical a thought for medieval science. For the wealthy, the battle against air turned into a style statement. Nobles didn't just protect themselves, they flaunted their immunity. Long, trailing gowns, embroidered gloves, and hoods lined with fur were all the rage. Perfumed handkerchiefs were tucked into sleeves, not just to mask odours, but to serve as portable filters. A true lady could faint elegantly, collapsing into her own cloud of scented safety. Then came the veils. Women covered their faces not just for modesty, but as spiritual armour. A veil, they believed, protected the mouth, the gateway through which corrupted air entered. The longer and thicker the veil, the better. At certain points, noble women's veils grew so elaborate they doubled as personal air curtains. Some historians claim this trend indirectly inspired the concept of privacy. Others think it was just everyone's attempt to avoid smelling one another. Men were no less ridiculous. Physicians and scholars wore long robes and hoods even indoors. Judges sat through hours of court hearings swaddled like winter monks, occasionally pausing to mop sweat from their brows. It wasn't vanity, it was self-preservation. They genuinely believed that a gust of air on the neck could paralyse you or summon lung fevers. A well-dressed man was one who could barely move his arms. Peasants, of course, turned necessity into resilience. They wrapped scarves, aprons, and even straw around exposed skin. Farmers ploughing the fields did so under layers of wool, convinced that the fresh breeze off the hills was plotting their demise. Better rot than dead, they'd mutter, before passing out halfway through harvesting turnips. The most devoted air fighters even stuffed aromatic herbs into their clothing. Lavender stitched into sleeves, rosemary tucked into hats, cloves hidden in collars, walking herb garden designed to ward off both odour and illness. Some went further, soaking their clothes in vinegar before wearing them, creating the medieval equivalent of a human salad. It wasn't pleasant, but it was medical, and yet, as absurd as it all sounds, this paranoia wasn't completely without merit. Heavy clothing did provide a primitive form of protection, not from air, but from fleas and other pests. A thick wool tunic made it harder for plague-carrying insects to bite, which meant some of these overdressed sufferers accidentally improved their odds of survival. Their fashion sense might have been suicidal in summer, but it was unintentionally life-saving in winter. Still, for every person saved by a well-placed cloak, dozens more fainted from heat stroke or suffocated under the combined weight of linen and fear. Hospitals filled with patients who weren't ill from the plague, but from dehydration. Priests would whisper last rites while fanning themselves with parchment, muttering that God's air grows heavier every year. By the 15th century, as understanding of contagion slowly shifted, the trend of excessive layering began to fade, but only slightly. It would take centuries before people fully trusted the idea that open windows weren't secret assassins. For the medievals, a breeze was a risk, and a wardrobe was a weapon. So the next time you throw on a hoodie and complain that it's too warm, remember, you could have been a 14th century farmer wrapped in 3 layers of damp wool, clutching a pouch of thyme and praying your armpit didn't become the neck site of divine punishment. It's easy to laugh now, but those layers, ridiculous as they seem, were humanity's earliest experiment in personal protective equipment. Half superstition, half survival instinct, and entirely drenched in sweat. Medieval towns started building high walls, narrow streets, and small windows, all in the name of safety from wind. Ironically, it trapped more filth inside. You could smell your neighbour's breakfast, their goat, and their slow descent into infection. If the Middle Ages had an urban design philosophy, it could be summed up as make it tight, make it dark, and make sure no air escapes. City planners, guided by doctors who feared a stiff breeze more than a rat plague, set about constructing towns that looked like mazes and smelled like compost heaps. The logic was simple. If wind carried disease, then stillness must mean safety. So they walled themselves in, quite literally, and called it progress. At the heart of every medieval city was paranoia disguised as architecture. Streets twisted into claustrophobic alleys, designed not for convenience, but for containment. The smaller the space, the less chance miasma had to sneak through. Tall buildings leaned over narrow lanes, their upper floors nearly touching, blocking out sunlight and turning cities into permanent twilight zones. It wasn't romantic or mysterious. It was a medieval airlock. Windows were another casualty of this anti-air crusade. Large openings were deemed reckless, almost suicidal. So builders kept them small, often sealed them with parchment or waxed cloth instead of glass. Curtains stayed closed year-round, and ventilation became an act of rebellion. If you opened your shutters, your neighbours might whisper that you'd invited the devil in, and then catch your cold and blame you for it. Inside the homes, things were even worse. Without airflow, heat from the hearth turned rooms into smoky ovens. Soot-covered walls, beams and lungs alike. Families, livestock, and sometimes paying boarders all shared the same cramped quarters, inhaling one another's fumes. When someone sneezed, it wasn't just heard, it was felt. You didn't need to live with someone to share their air. You just needed to live within the same block. The irony is that while medieval people were terrified of air, their real problem was beneath their feet. The lack of drainage and sanitation meant that waste seeped through every street and courtyard. But rather than design cities to remove filth, they built them to contain it. Sewers were rare, open ditches common, and the phrase, "it's just the smell of life," became an accepted excuse for horror. As one chronicler politely put it, "The air of the town is thick with vigour." Translation, it stank so bad you could taste it. Markets added to the chaos. Butchers slaughtered animals right beside bread sellers. Fishmongers dumped entrails into gutters, where they mixed with chamber pot runoff and the occasional unfortunate cat. And yet, people believed that as long as they carried a pouch of herbs or a vinegar-soaked cloth, they were safe. They didn't need clean streets, they needed clean smells. Over time, cities grew upward and inward. Defensive walls meant to keep invaders out also kept wind and fresh air at bay. Inside, courtyards became stagnant pockets of disease. When plague struck, the infection spread fast, a perfect storm of human density, flea traffic, and trapped air. In their attempt to block out sickness, medieval towns had built the world's first large-scale petri dishes. Even religious buildings followed the pattern. Churches, with their soaring walls and tiny stained glass windows, were beautiful but suffocating. Incense filled the air, mixing with candle smoke and the breath of hundreds of worshippers. The faithful coughed through sermons about divine punishment, never realizing they were slowly fumigating themselves. Still, the fear of wind persisted for centuries. Even when sailors and travellers reported that open-air living seemed healthier, city dwellers refused to believe it. Fresh air kills, doctors said, and that was that. The urban poor, trapped in their own unventilated homes, simply accepted that life was supposed to smell like mortality. Ironically, some of the most infamous disease outbreaks in Europe, from the Black Death to cholera, thrived in these same suffocating conditions. But each new disaster only reinforced the superstition. The air must have gone bad again, they'd mutter, hammering shutters shut tighter, doubling down on the very thing that doomed them. When the Renaissance finally brought fresh architectural ideas, it wasn't just art and science that changed, it was air. Architects began to rediscover the value of light and openness. Courtyards widened, windows grew larger, streets straightened to allow wind to pass through. The shift wasn't immediate, but slowly the walls came down, both literally and medically. Looking back, it's almost poetic. Medieval people built their cities like fortresses against the invisible, not realizing they were walling themselves inside the enemy's camp. Their fear of air shaped entire skylines, narrow, cramped, and perpetually dim. So the next time you open a window and feel a breeze drift through your room, remember, you're enjoying something that your medieval ancestors would have boarded up and prayed against. They built their world to hold its breath, and in doing so proved that nothing is more dangerous than fear with a hammer. Everyone hated the smell but blamed each other. Markets reeked of rotting meat, tanners boiled animal hides, and doctors said, "It's fine, just wear more perfume." Air quality, in short, was a group project everyone failed. The medieval city was, in every sense, a sensory experience, and not a pleasant one. Step outside your door and the first thing that hit you wasn't sunlight. It was stench. It wafted from every corner, open drains, livestock, overflowing chamber pots, mingling into a bouquet of decay so thick you could chew it. People gagged, cursed, and then did nothing, because they thought the smell wasn't the problem. The bad air was merely a symptom of invisible forces, demons, divine wrath, or just unfortunate weather. Each profession contributed to the grand orchestra of odour. Butchers dumped carcasses in the streets. Fishmongers tossed heads and entrails into rivers already half solid with waste. Tanneries were the worst, vats of decomposing flesh steeped in urine and lime bubbling gently in the sun. The smell could peel the paint off your memories, yet tanners defended their craft proudly. It's not filth, they'd argue. It's the smell of industry. And the doctors, they doubled down, insisting the only real danger was the air that carried the smell, not the filth creating it. So everyone kept making more filth. Markets were the epicenter of this aromatic apocalypse. Imagine a public square packed with chickens, pigs and humans, all sweating together in the summer heat. Vegetables rotted next to eels, cheese oozed beside bloodied meat, and someone somewhere was always boiling something suspicious. At least it's lively, visitors would say before promptly fainting. The stench wasn't just local, it was portable. Clothes absorbed it, hair carried it, even coins smelled. You could tell a city's wealth by how bad its money reeked. Then there were the rivers. Every city had one, and every city used it as both a water source and a sewer. The current will carry it away, they said, as if rivers were self-cleaning miracles instead of open veins of infection. London's Thames, Paris's Seine, Florence's Arno, all of them flowed brown and bubbly, carrying humanity's collective sins downstream. Fish died, but people didn't connect the dots. If the river stank, it was just the air acting up again. To combat the smell, people turned to scent, perfumes, herbs, and incense. But in typical medieval fashion, they overdid it. Streets became smoky fog banks of clashing aromas, roses over dung, cinnamon over sewage, lavender valiantly losing the battle. Wealthy citizens hung sachets of musk and ambergris around their necks, while the poor waved bundles of herbs like defensive wands. The goal wasn't cleanliness, it was camouflage. If you couldn't fix the stink, you could at least drown in perfume while pretending to. And when everyone is equally smelly, blame becomes complicated. The butcher blamed the tanner blamed the baker's smoke, the baker blamed the fishmonger's leftovers, and everyone blamed the beggars because they couldn't defend themselves. It's their filth that poisons us, people said, ignoring the literal cesspools under their own floors. The stench was both a communal experience and a moral judgment, a way to point at someone else and say, "You're the reason the world smells like this." The church weighed in too, of course. Priests called the odour a test from God, proof that the city's sins had reached heaven's nostrils. Some even claimed that enduring the smell without complaint was a sign of piety. It built character, they said. It built nausea too. But that part didn't make it into the sermons. Meanwhile, doctors kept prescribing the same advice. Block the smell, carry flowers, burn incense, stuff your nose with cloth. One enthusiastic physician recommended holding oranges soaked in vinegar near your face at all times. The result was an entire population walking around clutching fruit, looking like they were perpetually about to faint at a noble ball. But the real paradox was this. While everyone feared bad air, no one thought to clean the air's source. They fought the symptom, not the system. It took centuries, and a few catastrophic epidemics, before anyone realised the stench wasn't just unpleasant, it was deadly. When cholera arrived centuries later, reformers finally traced sickness to sewage, not spirits. Cities tore up streets, installed drains, and let air flow again. The Great Stink of London in 1858 would become the breaking point, but its roots were planted in every medieval town that ever decided to wall itself in and perfume the problem away. So, yes, medieval life stank. Not figuratively, literally. And in their attempt to fight the invisible with rose petals and denial, they gave us one of history's longest-running jokes. A civilization terrified of bad smells that never stopped making them. It took centuries before someone realised germs, not air, spread disease. Microscopes replaced incense, and hygiene replaced superstition. Suddenly, opening a window wasn't treason, it was progress. For most of human history, illness was treated like bad luck with a smell. But in the 17th century, something remarkable happened. People started looking, literally. When Dutch spectacle maker Antony van Leeuwenhoek peered through his homemade lenses, he saw what no one else had. A hidden world teeming with animalcules, tiny, wriggling creatures that lived in water, on teeth, and horrifyingly inside us. While most scholars dismissed his discovery as a curiosity, it was the first crack in miasma's centuries-old monopoly on medical thought. Still, progress moves slowly when everyone's afraid of fresh air. Doctors clung to the comfort of incense and vinegar, claiming microscopes were toys for philosophers. But as microscopes improved and more curious minds took a peek, the truth became harder to ignore. Invisible life was everywhere. And it wasn't angels or vapours, it was bacteria. The world's greatest villain had finally been caught red-handed, or more accurately, caught swimming in pond water. The 19th century brought the revolution full circle. Louis Pasteur, the man with more experiments than patience, began proving that tiny organisms caused fermentation and disease. With a mix of brilliance and stubbornness, he debunked spontaneous generation, the idea that life simply appeared from filth. Pasteur boiled things, sealed jars, and showed that given a clean environment, nothing grew. In other words, bad air didn't make you sick. Bad hygiene did. Then came Joseph Lister, who took Pasteur's findings straight to the operating table. Surgery in those days was a blood-slick lottery. Instruments were wiped on aprons, and surgeons took pride in their good old pus. Lister decided enough was enough. He doused wounds in carbolic acid, sterilised his tools, and watched infection rates plummet. His colleagues laughed at first, as doctors tend to do when someone suggests washing their hands, but soon they couldn't argue with the results. The miasma theory was on life support, and science was sharpening the scalpel. By the late 1800s, even the public began to catch on. Soap, once a luxury, became a necessity. Hospitals opened their windows, and ventilation transformed from a death sentence into a cure. Architects designed airy wards, cities built sewer systems, and clean became fashionable. The very thing medieval doctors had feared, air, became a symbol of health and modernity. But superstition dies harder than germs. Some people still clung to the comfort of old ideas. They insisted that miasma had simply changed form, or that cleanliness offended the spirits. Old habits die slowly, especially when they smell like rose oil and nostalgia. Yet the evidence was undeniable. When people cleaned their surroundings, disease rates dropped. When they didn't, the plagues returned. The choice was suddenly clear: scrub or suffer. This transformation wasn't just medical, it was cultural. The concept of public health was born. Governments began taking responsibility for sanitation. Streets were paved, waste was managed, and cities started to smell, well, less medieval. Fresh air became not just tolerated, but prescribed. Doctors encouraged sunlight, exercise, and open windows. A draft no longer symbolised doom, or else it meant recovery. And yet, in a strange twist of fate, the same human impulse that once blamed air for everything turned into an obsession with purity. The war against invisible filth didn't end with the microscope, or else it evolved. Germophobia, antiseptic advertising, and the myth of the spotless home all trace back to that moment when humanity finally sneezed, and realised why. So, the next time you throw open a window, thank Van Leeuwenhoek's lens, Pasteur's patience, and Lister's acid-sprayed persistence. They didn't just change medicine, they changed the way we breathe. Because in the end, progress isn't about conquering nature, it's about finally understanding that a little fresh air never killed anyone, except maybe, just maybe, a few medieval doctors. And yet something of that fear lingers. Every time you light a candle to cleanse the vibe or spray lavender to reset your energy, you're participating in the longest-running placebo in history, the war against invisible air. It's funny, isn't it? For all our scientific breakthroughs, our satellites, vaccines and Wi-Fi, we still cling to the same ancient instinct. If it smells bad, it must be dangerous. And if it smells nice, it must be safe. We might not fear miasma anymore, but the ghosts of it still whisper through every scented candle aisle. The medieval doctor would feel right at home in your local spa. Only now, instead of vinegar-soaked masks, it's eucalyptus diffusers and Himalayan salt lamps. The tools have changed, but the impulse, not so much. The truth is, scent is survival. Our brains are wired to treat smell as a danger signal. It's one of our oldest warning systems. The stench of rot meant infection, death, or spoiled food, long before we had microscopes to explain why. So, when medieval people panicked over bad smells, they weren't completely wrong. Their noses were doing their best with limited information. They just got the cause a little backwards. Fast forward a few centuries and humanity still hasn't shaken the habit. We just rebranded it. The plague doctor's lavender pouch became the luxury candle. The bundles of rosemary hanging from medieval ceilings are now sage smudge sticks. Instead of trying to ward off disease, we say we're banishing bad energy. But deep down, it's the same instinct. A desire to make the invisible feel controllable. Because if the air smells nice, maybe life does too. Our homes, too, remain shrines to sanitized comfort. Disinfectant wipes, antibacterial sprays, air purifiers, the modern incense of the nervous age. We scrub, polish, and mist the air with artificial freshness, terrified not of demons or miasma, but of toxins and germs. Somewhere, a medieval monk who once sprinkled rosewater on the floor of a plague ward is looking down, proud that humanity has kept the faith. Even our language still carries the old fear. We talk about toxic environments, bad vibes, and clean energy. Offices promise air wellness. Hotels sell signature scents. We've turned purification into an aesthetic. Medieval peasants burned herbs to survive. We do it for ambience, but the subconscious reasoning is eerily identical. Smell equals safety. And who can blame us? The air is invisible. You can't see it, can't hold it, and yet it shapes your entire existence. That mystery leaves space for imagination, and imagination loves drama. For medieval people, it was demons in the wind. For us, it's microplastics, pollutants, and the creeping sense that we should probably open a window more often. The details differ, but the anxiety is timeless. Of course, the modern obsession with scent also has its softer side. Smell connects us to memory, comfort, and identity. A whiff of cinnamon might remind you of your grandmother's kitchen. Rain on pavement might make you nostalgic for childhood. Medieval people, living in worlds of decay and incense, used scent the same way, to find beauty in the unbearable. A sprig of lavender by the bed wasn't just medicine. It was hope that the air could still be kind. Even our luxury industries owe their existence to that ancient paranoia. Perfume began as plague protection, concentrated good smells to overpower the bad. Centuries later, it's still marketed as transformation in a bottle. Spray it on, and you're untouchable, radiant, clean. The message hasn't changed, only the price tag. And in a way, the persistence of scent as comfort is beautiful. It reminds us that beneath the science and skepticism, we're still human, creatures who crave control over chaos, who want our air to smell like safety, even if it's just an illusion. The medieval world feared what it couldn't see. We fear what we can't filter. Both are perfectly reasonable, given that most of life is invisible and unpredictable. So the next time you light a candle and take a deep breath, imagine a medieval peasant doing the same, clutching a handful of herbs, praying that the air won't kill them tonight. They weren't fools. They were just early believers in what we now call aromatherapy. History may have cured the plague, but it never cured the human need to feel protected. We've simply replaced the church bell with an air purifier, the miasma mask with a eucalyptus mist, and the superstition with science-sounding marketing. Because deep down, we're all still fighting the same invisible war, one lavender-scented breath at a time. And now, as the candles burn low and the world outside your window hums quietly with electricity, take a slow breath, a real, deep one, and think about how lucky that simple act makes you. Because once upon a time, breathing was dangerous. Every gust of wind was a suspect, every breeze a whispered threat. People fought invisible enemies with garlic, incense, and hope. They built cities that couldn't breathe and wore clothes that trapped their fear inside. They sweated, they suffered, and somehow they survived. And through it all there was humour, unintentional but beautiful. Doctors in bird masks, nobles perfumed like walking spice racks, peasants smearing themselves in mud to ward off death. It's easy to laugh now, but their absurdity was born from courage, from the same human stubbornness that kept them alive long enough for us to know better. They didn't have penicillin, clean water, or weather apps warning them of high pollen levels, but they had willpower. They endured the unendurable and kept breathing through the fear, a small defiant act that echoes across centuries. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep in a room filled with clean sheets, filtered air, and quiet comfort, maybe whisper a thank you to those who came before, the ones who fought the plague with prayer, who sealed their windows against invisible death, who paved the way, quite literally for fresh air and peace. Because history isn't just gross and terrifying, it's proof that people, even at their smelliest and most superstitious, never stopped trying to make things better. Now breathe in, breathe out. You've made it to the calm part of history. Sleep well and dream in clean air.